In my review of Carrie, I announced that I would be going through all of Stephen King's books in publication order. Guys, I didn't realize King had like 70 books published. This is going to be a monumental task. A whole lifetime of nightmares crammed into one bibliography. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, yeah, why not? I've already read a few of his books, and I love diving deep into these stories, and let's be honest, his books build on each other. King isn't just a storyteller, he's a world builder. His novels bleed into one another, characters reappear, places echo across his books. So here we are, episode 2 of Into the Kingverse. Let's keep this journey going and let's see how far we get. And since Salem's Lot is a book I haven't read before, I'm really excited to share my thoughts and observations. If Carrie was the explosion that introduced King to the world, then Salem's Lot is where he really stretches his legs. Salem's Lot is Dracula meets small town America. And that's what makes it work. The story follows a writer named Ben Mears, and he's returning to his hometown of Jerusalem's Lot, or just Salem's Lot for short. See, he's haunted by the creepy abandoned Marston house, and it's a place that left a deep psychological imprint on him as a child. He's back to write a book about it and maybe even exorcise some personal demons. The problem is, someone else has recently moved into the Marston house, a man named Kurt Barlow, and he just so happens to be an old world vampire who has zero interest in seducing teenage girls or moping about eternity. No, this guy is pure, unapologetic evil. And with the help of his human servant, Richard Straker, he quietly starts infecting the town. People go missing, then they come back. And before you know it, the town is completely overrun by vampires. Ben teams up with a small group to fight back, including the young Mark Petrie, who is basically every horror-loving kid who ever lived. The wise and skeptical Matt Burke, the tragic yet fascinating Father Callahan, and Susan Norton, Ben's love interest. And let's just say, not all of them make it out alive. Salem's Lot is fantastic, not just as a vampire novel, but as a King novel. First off, the vampires? They're absolutely terrifying. This isn't Twilight. This isn't Interview with a Vampire. Although, I do love that novel and the TV show isn't bad either. There's no romance, no existential brooding, no tragic anti-heroes lamenting their immortality. These vampires are monsters. They aren't misunderstood souls. They are predators, pure and simple, creatures of pure hunger, spreading death like an infectious disease. King doesn't try to reinvent the mythology. He perfects it. Stakes through the heart, garlic, holy water. They can't enter a house unless invited. They hunt at night, sleep in coffins during the day. King takes the classic vampire rules, the stuff that goes all the way back to Dracula, and places them in the modern world. Well, 1975 modern. And that's what makes Salem's Lot so effective. There's nothing new about the vampires themselves. What's new is seeing them invade a quiet, small town setting that feels frighteningly real. And that's the real horror of this book. Not just that vampires exist, but that they can consume a town so effortlessly. It doesn't take some grand war or a bloodbath to turn Salem's Lot into a ghost town. It happens quietly. People disappear one by one. The survivors whisper their theories, but no one really wants to believe. And by the time anyone is willing to act, it's already too late. And that's where we get to the town itself. Salem's Lot isn't just a setting, it's a character. This is where King really starts to show his love-hate relationship with small-town America. Salem's Lot has long memories, deep secrets, and a dark history it would rather ignore. The town existed long before Barlow arrived, but in a way it was already dying. Barlow didn't destroy Salem's Lot, he exposed it. King plays with the idea that small towns hold on to their sins like family heirlooms, passing them down generation to generation. A place like Salem's Lot doesn't need a vampire infestation to decay. It was already on the way out. The vampires just sped up the process. The book makes a chilling argument. Maybe some towns just deserve to die. And let's talk about Father Callahan. Callahan isn't just a priest. He's a man obsessed with fighting real supernatural evil. He wants to battle demons and vampires, but when the time comes, when he actually faces Barlow, his faith fails him. Callahan has spent his entire life believing in capital E evil. The idea that the darkness in the world, it must be confronted. But when Barlow actually steps into his life, when evil becomes real, he folds. He realizes that he was never as strong as he thought he was, and that his faith has always been shaky at best. And the moment when Barlow forces him to drink his blood, oh my god, it's absolutely devastating. Not because it turns him into a vampire. It doesn't. Instead, it damns him. He tries to return to his church, but the door won't open for him anymore. He's spiritually tainted, cast out, rejected, and not just by God, but by the very structure he's dedicated his life to. He leaves Salem's Lot a broken man. But here's the thing. Callahan isn't the only broken character in this book. In Salem's Lot, nobody really wins. Ben Mears, he loses the woman he loves. Mark Petrie, his parents are murdered in front of him and he's forced to grow up just way too fast. The entire town, wiped off of the map, lost to history. Even the victories feel hollow. Killing Barlow doesn't fix anything. Burning the town down doesn't erase what happened. The horror of Salem's Lot isn't just the vampires. It's the idea that some things are too big to fight. Some horrors, they just can't be defeated. Sometimes you just have to run and hope you can live with yourself afterward. And can we just take a moment to talk about how this book is just horror comfort food? It's the mac and cheese for horror fans. Is it the most sophisticated horror novel ever written? No. But does it hit every single mark perfectly? Absolutely. It's the kind of book that's just fun to read, and I imagine it's just as fun on rereads. You can settle into it like a well-worn sweater, enjoy the slow burn buildup, and get absolutely wrecked by those final chapters. And every time you come back, you're going to find something new. Like how this book foreshadows King's later works in ways you don't notice the first time around. At least I didn't. The way Mark Petrie fights back against Danny Glick by repeating a tongue twister in his head. That exact phrase, he thrusts his fists against a post and still insists he sees the ghost, will show up later in It, when Bill Denbrough, he uses it to fight against Pennywise. The way the Marston house looms over Salem's Lot is just like the Overlook Hotel looming over The Shining. The way King establishes early on that small towns aren't just places, but real living, breathing things that can hold on to darkness. This is the book where King starts to feel like King. It's the book where you can see all the tropes, themes, and motifs that will define the rest of his career and start to take shape. The writer-protagonist, the haunted town, the battle between good and evil, the inevitability of fate, the creeping dread that turns into outright terror. And yeah, it's just a damn good vampire story. If Dracula is the grandfather of vampire fiction, then Stephen King is the eccentric uncle who rolled in, trashed the place, and dragged the genre kicking and screaming into the modern world. Look, if you're a horror fan, Salem's Lot is essential reading. If you're a Stephen King fan, it's foundational reading. This is a book that doesn't just stand as one of the best vampire novels ever written. It's also the blueprint for everything King would go on to explore in his career. You can tell King didn't want to modernize vampires. He wanted to drop them in the real world and see what happens. And what happens? Pure, creeping, inescapable dread. This book is scary, but not in a in-your-face blood and gore type of way. The horror here is subtle, it's psychological, and most terrifyingly of all, inevitable. You've got Danny Glick floating outside of Mark Petrie's window whispering, "Let me in," which, is just one of the most iconic scenes in horror fiction. It plays on childhood fears in a way that's universal. Every kid has stared out their window at night feeling like something is just beyond their field of vision, waiting. But in this case, there really is something out there, and it wants in. The funeral of Danny Glick, if Pet Sematary is King's masterpiece of grief, then Salem's Lot is his first serious attempt at it. The way King captures the weight of a child's death, the ripple effects of loss, the unsettling feeling that death might not just be the end, it's harrowing. In the slow psychological breakdown of the survivors, they're not just fighting vampires, they're fighting their own disbelief, their own trauma, and their own past. And that's something Salem's Lot does better than almost any other vampire story. It forces its characters to confront the unknown, because fear isn't always about the monster itself. Fear is about what you can't see. Fear is the thing in the dark. Fear is the closed door slightly ajar. And Salem's Lot, it understands that. One of the book's most haunting ideas is that childhood fears never really go away. They just get buried under the weight of adulthood. When we're kids, we believe in the thing under the bed. We feel its presence. And the only way to survive is to grow up and stop believing. In other words, to let our imaginations die. But what happens when the thing under the bed was real all along? Mark Petrie doesn't survive this story because he's the strongest or the smartest. He survives because he believes first. He doesn't let his rational mind explain things away. When Danny Glick is at his window whispering to let him in, Mark doesn't question whether vampires are real. He just acts. And in that moment, he proves that belief is a weapon. It's no coincidence that this is the first King novel where the protagonist is a writer. And we all know King loves writing about writers. Ben Mears is basically the prototype for every King protagonist going forward. But unlike Jack Torrance in The Shining, Paul Sheldon in Misery, or Bill Denbrough in It, Ben doesn't let his writing isolate him from the world. He's not a man spiraling into obsession. He's a man trying to reclaim something. He returns to Salem's Lot because he wants to understand his past, to put his ghost to rest. But King doesn't deal in neat resolutions. There's no great revelation, no moment of closure. Ben doesn't conquer his childhood demons. He just survives them. And in a Stephen King novel, that's about the best you can hope for. And of course, with Father Callahan, we have one of the most tragic characters in early King. And it sets up something we'll see again and again in his work. The idea that good isn't always strong enough to fight evil. That sometimes good people, they're just bound to lose. Because that's the real horror of Salem's Lot. It's not just that vampires exist. It's that they win. The town is gone. The people are dead. The survivors are broken. Even the victories feel hollow. Killing Barlow, it doesn't fix anything. Burning the town down doesn't erase what happened. The horror of Salem's Lot isn't just the vampires. It's the idea that some things are too big to fight. Some horrors can't be defeated. Sometimes you just have to run and hope you can live with yourself afterward. And that brings me to my final point. This book doesn't just stand on its own. It's not just a great horror novel. It's a critical piece of Kingverse. Father Callahan's story continues in The Dark Tower. The town of Jerusalem's Lot is referenced in Pet Sematary, The Dead Zone, and The Night Flyer. And the mythos of vampires, they get expanded across multiple King's books. And what makes Salem's Lot so special is that it's the perfect standalone horror novel and the doorway into something much bigger. So yeah, if you haven't read Salem's Lot, you have to fix that immediately. Because this isn't just one of King's best books, it's one of the best horror novels ever written. So guys, that's Salem's Lot. If you've read the book, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I may not be as well read as other King fans, but I thought Salem's Lot was a brilliant novel, and it's one of my favorites from his collection. And come to think of it, it might actually be my third favorite book of his, only behind The Stand and The Shining. And with that, we're officially moving forward on this journey. Up next, since I've already reviewed The Shining recently, I'm jumping into Rage, the first Richard Bachman book. I haven't read it and I don't know anything about it except for the title. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, family, and even your enemies. Just no century-old vampires. Or any vampires for that matter. And of course, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button because every subscriber inches me one step closer to taking over the Galaxies. What was that? Did you hear that? I think there's someone outside my window.